So what is international trade? The world economics are changing rapidly, and most countries of the world, including the developing countries, are gearing up to the changes of competing in a highly integrated global marketplace. In such a situation, the issue of international trade is attaining much attention of the government authorities, traders, policymakers in the last few years. So for the developing countries, especially a country like India, growth requires a steady flow of imported capital and intermediate goods. And this in returns necessitates us foreign exchange to pay for them. In this end, what we understand is the framework of the global trade, its characteristics, limitations and international cooperations in trade finance, practices and the international situations that assist the international trade operations. Now let's understand why countries trade. There are two basic types of trade between countries. The first, in which the receiving country itself cannot produce the goods or provide the services in question, or where they do not have enough. In the second instance, they have the capability to producing the goods or supplying the services but still import them. The rationale for the first kind of trade is very clear. So long as the importing country can afford to buy the product or service, they are able to acquire things which otherwise they would have to do without. Example of differing significance, the import of bananas in the UK in response to consumer demand, or copper to China, an essential for China manufacturing industry. The second kind of trade is greater interest because it accounts for a majority of world trade today, and the rationale is more complex. The UK imports motor cars, coal, oil, TV sets, domestic appliances and white goods, IT equipments, clothing and many more products which it was well able to produce domestically until it either transferred production abroad or ceased the production as local industries became incompetitive. Okay? At first sight, it would seem a waste of resource to import goods from other places of the world in which a country could perfectly well be self-sufficient. However, the reason for importing this category of product generally falls into three classifications. The imported goods may be cheaper than those products which are produced domestically. A greater variety of goods may be made available through imports. The imported goods may offer advantage other than lower price over domestic production, better quality of design, higher status of prestige, okay, or technical features. Basics of international or foreign trade. Foreign trade is based on the theory of comparative cost advantage. It states that every national exercises certain kinds of benefits from the production of a particular type of commodity whose resources are exclusively available in the nation or available in other nations at very few amounts. For example, Iraq and similar nations have comparative advantage over the production of crude oil. Here, it can export it to other nations and earn huge profits. Similarly, India has sugarcane and tobacco, so no other country is self-sufficient and it has to depend on other nations to obtain the required inputs, be it machines, labor, raw material or even finished products. So the need of foreign trade arises due to the following factors. All nations in the world have to depend on the other nation, as it cannot produce everything by itself at the lower cost. A country may get into the resource and manpower to produce all type of commodities, but it may be able to get that commodity at a cheaper rate from the other nation who specialize in the production of the commodity. In a third instance, a country may produce some goods at a cheaper rate than the other nation and may try to export it to other nation at a higher rate if there is a surplus. Okay, so difficulties in international trade is now the important challenge. One can be distance. Due to long geographical distance between two nations, goods are either sent through rail, road or sea or air. All these modes of transport are expensive and may face the dangers of sea or air perils such as explosions or accidents. So there may be a delay in the delivery of goods that may lead to the spoilage of certain perishable goods. Distance creates higher transport costs as well as more risk. Another challenge can be language. Different languages are spoken in different parts of the world, so the buyers and the sellers may not be able to communicate with each other effectively. They may have to depend on the translator that are not always reliable. Risks in transit. Foreign trade involves high risk than the home trade. Many of the risks can be covered by insurance, but still the danger persists. Lack of information about foreign businessmen. We really don't know who the person is. So the seller is always worried about the credit worthiness of the financial standing of the prospective buyer, as there is no strong proof of the buyer's ability to pay or not to pay. So the risk of bad credit is up to the seller. Let's now understand the characteristics of international trade. So the territorial specifications or the specialization is this. International trade among the countries is possible only because each country has certain resources that can be well utilized for the production of certain types of commodity that is not always available in other countries or available in very less quantities. Hence, these countries have some sort of competitive cost advantage. That means each country can produce a good at a lower price than the other country, and hence they can export that. So international competition producers from different nations are always in a race to which other to sell their products in as much quantity as possible. So advertisements, sales promotions, activities are very helpful in this kind of things, which we say self-selling techniques. Organizations and world trade. The aim of all three organizations was to attempt to establish international approach to trade and to economic development, which would enhance world wealth, huge money, while helping countries to adjust to economic fluctuations. So the first one is IMF, International Monetary Fund. The IMF's primary task is to try to regulate the way in which countries adjust to fluctuate in exchange rates. The IMF was set up to provide a way in each country there is an experiment of trades which they used to do. So they used to borrow money and all. So there was a debt for which country, another country has huge money. So member countries subscribe their currencies and gold, which are used in theory to assist deficient nations. For the purpose, the IMF also established a regime of currency rates and a form of world money called special drawing rights. Okay, in the last 60-65 years, the IMF has contributed significantly to the way which world trade has been able to expand today. It has also played a crucial role in helping to rescue the economics of countries from bankruptcy through external debt. The next organization is the World Bank. The World Bank was established, as an original title implies, World Bank, to help with post-war reconstruction. It was initially known as the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Since 1945, the World Bank has taken on the role of providing loans at preferential rates, mostly to developing countries, for projects which will assist and accelerate their economic development. These projects are irrigation and hydroelectricity schemes and roads and power supply. So from 1980s onward, the World Bank has taken to a new role of supporting the IMF also in debt relief. That is, between 1960s and 1980s, many countries, particularly in South Africa, South America, had accumulated substantial amount of external debt, in which the annual interest alone was creating a lot of hardship. So this scale of the debt was also creating the risk that a country would simply be out of the world map. That can be even bought. So following the 1990s, or you can say 2005, in a summit where we say G8 summit of the nations, World Bank together with the IMF and the African Development Bank have been implementing the multilateral debt relief initiative that we say as MDRI. The MDRI gives 100% eligible outstanding debt owed to the three institutions by the countries reaching to completion point where they have satisfied the conditions of HIPC initiative. Okay, by the end of 2006, 19 countries has reached the competition point. Okay, then there is another thing which is called GATT, General Agreement of Tariff and Trade. So the GET or GET, which was actually from WTO, it was established in 1995, 1st January, was to avoid competitive traffic wars which happened in 1930. So the GATT was signed at Geneva in 1947 and came into operations in 1948. So over a series of this kind of negotiations which happened, which we say rounds of negotiation from 1945 onwards, so GATT established binding agreements on its members to reduce the tariffs. Each round reduced general tariffs further. further, thereby creating the conditions for steady increase of world trade. So, under the GATT arrangements, any proposal to impose a new tariff has to be submitted to GATT, or any disputes between members, in theory, to be settled by reference of GATT. So, GATT rules for preventing infringements of tariff concessions and keeping the channels of trade open are based on major two principles. One is most favored nations treatment for members and non-discrimination. Okay. However, many captions are allowed. Controls in conflict with the rules are permitted if they were in operation with the general agreements, that GATT agreement, or in case of new members when they first enter into negotiation. Okay. New restrictive measures of a discriminatory nature are allowed under certain conditions, the most important being safeguarding the balance of payments. Okay. Since the conclusion of the Uruguay round, which happened in 1993 December, what happened is it went slower though. WTO members has continued to grow, notably with the addition of China in December 2001, and most effective dispute resolution procedures have been adopted by the time. What is export? Export is a function of international trade whereby goods produced in one country are shipped to another country for further sale or trade. The sale of such goods adds to the production of nation's growth output. If used for trade, exports are exchanged for other products or services in other countries. Now let's break down the export. Export are one of the oldest form of economic transfer and occurs on the large scale between nations that have favor restrictions on trade, such as tariffs or subsidies. Most of the largest companies operating in advanced economics derive a substantial portion of their annual revenues from exports to other countries. So the ability to export goods help an economy to grow by selling more overall goods and services. So one of the core functions of diplomacy and foreign policy within the government is to foster the economic trades in ways that benefit both parties which are involved. So exports are a crucial component of a country's economy. Not only do exports facilitate international trade, they also stimulate domestic economic activity by creating employment, productions, and revenues. As of 2016, the world's largest exporting countries in terms of dollars are China, United States, Germany, Netherlands, India. No, India is not. So that's the thing, we have to get India in the top. The United States exports approximately $1.6 trillion of capital goods. Germany exports approximately $1.5 trillion, and Japan exports almost $750 billion of exports from their motor vehicles only. So finally, the Netherlands has exports of approximately $750 billion, which is into exports of machineries and chemicals. So what is the advantage of exporting for companies? Companies export products and services for a multitude of reasons. First, exporting, if done correctly, has the ability to increase sales and profits by expanding into new markets. It may even present an opportunity to capture significant global market share. Companies that export spread business risk by diversifying into multiple markets. Export into foreign markets can often reduce per unit cost by expanding operations to meet increased demand. Finally, companies that export into foreign markets generally gain new knowledge and experience that may allow discovery of new technologies, marketing practices, and insights into foreign competitors. Okay, so what are the challenges of exporting? So companies that export are presented with a unique set of challenges. Extra costs are likely to be realized, as companies have to allocate considerable resources into researching the foreign markets and modifying the products to meet local demand and regulations. Okay, companies that exports are typical, they are exposed to a high degree of financial risk and collection of payment methods, such as open account, letter of credit, prepayment, and consignments are inherently more complex and take longer to process than for domestic consumers. So how exports affect the economy? Most countries want to increase their export. Their companies want to sell more. If they have sold all that they can from the companies and country's population, they want to sell overseas as well. The more they export, the greater their competitive advantage. That is because they gain expertise in producing the goods and services. They also gain knowledge about how to sell to foreign markets. Countries encouraging exports. That's because it increases jobs, brings in higher wages and rises the standards of living for the residents. They become happier and more likely to support their nation's leaders. Exports also increase the foreign exchange reserves held in the nation's central bank. Okay? That is because foreigners pay for export either in their own currency or in United States dollars. A country with larger reserve can use it to manage their own currency's value. They have enough foreign currency to flood the market with their own country money. The lower the cost of their exports in the countries. Okay? Countries also use currency reserves to manage liquidity. That allows them to better control inflation or too much money chasing too much or say very less goods. The foreign currency is to purchase their own currency. The lower the supply, making the local currency worth more, and that stops inflation in their country. India primarily exports to the United States, United Arab Emirates, China, Singapore and United Kingdom. Other major exporters of India, the products I'm talking about are vegetable, raw cotton, broadcasting equipments, iron ore, non-retail pure cotton yarns, vehicle parts, frozen meat. These are the things. What is import? An import is a good that is brought into the jurisdiction, especially across a national border, from an external source. The party bringing into the good is called an importer. An import in the receiving country is an export from the sending country. Importation or exportation is the defining financial transaction of the international trade. In international trade, the importation and exportation of goods are limited by import quotas and mandates from the custom authority. Okay? The importing and exporting jurisdiction may impose a tariff, or you can say tax, on the goods. In addition to the importation and exportation of goods are subject to trade between agreements between the importing and exporting countries, that is called the laws of jurisdiction. So there are two basic types of imports in this case: industrial and consumer goods, intermediate goods and services. So companies import goods and services to supply to the domestic market at a cheaper price and better quality than competing goods manufactured in the domestic market. Okay? Companies import products that are not available in the local market. So there are three broad types of importers. So looking for any product around the world to import and sell. Looking for foreign sourcing to get their products at the cheapest price. Using foreign sourcing as part of their global supply chain. Let's understand about the imports and the trade deficit. Most countries would prefer to import less and export more. Countries that rely on imports for important commodities such as food, oil and industrial materials are then dependent on other countries to keep their population fed and their manufacturers humming. Okay? So countries with higher import level then need to also increase their currency reserves to pay for the import. In other words, a country would prefer to be a supplier to other countries. So what import does? Imports provide competition to domestic companies who always want to sell more, whether it's locally or overseas. They also receive a competitive advantage by importing and exporting because they learn to excel in producing a variety of globally demanded goods and services. I'm talking about the export part. So countries' leaders encourage export-driven economies. It's the fastest way to boost the GDP, increase jobs and wages, and all of which raises residents' standard of living for residents. That means they have much more likely to vote for their national leaders in democracies. In countries without an elected leader, it is least means that is like less likelihood for a revolution. So now let's understand how do countries increase their exports. So they often start increasing trade protectionism, thus giving domestic industries a competitive advantage. They raise tariffs, which are taxes on imports, okay, which makes them more expensive. However, this runs the risk of retaliation by other countries that will raise tariffs as well. In fact, this was one of the causes of the Great Depression in 1930s. So it's usually safer to provide government subsidies to their own industries, which also lowers the prices. This runs slightly less risk of retaliation, okay, since they can claim the subsidies and temporary which are not going for the long run and needed for the poor to get the basic fuel and food. So emerging markets especially can use this claim. They can also say that to need to provide the industries to catch up with technology and similar industries in the developing markets, or you can say developed markets. Other way countries boost export is through the trade agreements. Once protectionism has lowered trade across the broader countries start to see each other in lowering the traffic. The most popular method countries use to increase exports is by lowering their currency value, like subsidies. This increases exports by lowering the prices of goods. Countries' central bank can lower interest rates, print more currencies, or buy a foreign currency to raise its value higher in comparison. Find out which countries are winning and losing their currency wars. Say, if a country imports more than it exports, it runs a trade deficit. Although we can produce everything we need, China, India, and other emerging markets, countries can make a lot of it and can like less is required, but because the standard of living is lower, so they pay less, okay. So this way the country has a competitive advantage, okay. India primarily export to the United States, USA, UAE, China, Singapore, and United Kingdom. The major exports, as we all have discussed, are iron ore and all. In the same way, India's import partners are again China, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, United States. Major import for the country are palm oil, telephone, mobile phones, jewelry, copper ore, computers, petroleum, broadcasting equipments, vehicle parts, scrap iron, and mixed materials, minerals, and fertilizers, chemicals. India's trade in merchandise has actually grown up since 2006. The country's economy is the 10th largest in the world and the 3rd largest in terms of purchasing power partially, or you can say PPP. Agriculture continues to be India's largest industry, but it has been in decline related to the growth of petroleum production, okay. Other significant industries in the country include pharmaceuticals, engineering, diamonds, gem polishing, and manufacture of jewelry, retail, tourism, banking, mining, and textiles. India's economy is expected to continue the growth, making the country as an attractive trade partner.